Hi everybody, this is Mrs. McQuaid, and today we're going to be talking about biology, the study of life. We're going to focus on the characteristics of living things and the biological levels of organization. If you'd like to print out these slides to take notes on, visit my website at www.sevengablescience.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment right on this video and I'll respond as soon as I'm able to. The objectives for this section include define and give examples of Earth's biodiversity, summarize the characteristics of all living things, and list the levels of biological organization that biologists study. Because this is kind of an overview of the entire year, you're going to get a lot of vocabulary here, so bear with me. The words you'll be exposed to include biology, DNA, stimulus, sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction, homeostasis, cell, evolution, universal genetic code, metabolism, biosphere, biodiversity, biome, species, heredity, adaptation, population, and community. It's a lot of words, but for now, you're just going to kind of get your first exposure to them. The words that are bolded here, I call them high impact words because you're going to see them again and again and again throughout the year. I strongly encourage you to focus on these words, as the sooner you learn them, the better foundation you're going to have for many of our future units. Let's get started. So all organisms share certain characteristics. An organism is any individual living thing, and biology is the study of life, so it's really the study of organisms. The first characteristic of living things is that they're all made of one or more cells. The cell is the smallest unit that's considered fully alive. They can grow, respond to their surroundings, and reproduce. And some living things are really small, like bacteria, and they only have one cell. But things like us, animals and trees and plants, we can have up to 100 trillion cells. So depending on how complex you are will determine how many different kinds of cells you have. The next characteristic that all living things share is that we're all based on a universal genetic code. What that means is we all store our information to build our cells and to run our body in a molecule called DNA. That information can be copied and passed from parents to offspring through the process called heredity. And the genetic code is pretty much identical for every living thing on the planet. What that means is any set of instructions in any living thing will be read the same way. Now, it's worth noting, I want you to pay attention to this image on the left-hand side of your screen here. So it says DNA is the molecule of life, and there's a lot of good vocabulary in there, right? So you can see chromosomes, gene, cell, and DNA. In lots of subjects, you get images, and they just kind of let you get a picture in your mind of what things look like. And that's true here, except that you get a lot of information in science images or models. So for example, you can see that DNA is coiled up, and you might know from previous classes that's called a double helix. You also should see a pattern in here, right? So you can see that every time you have a letter A on one strand, there's a letter T on the other strand. Every time you see a C on one strand, there's a letter G partnered with it on the other strand, and that's going to be really important. You even start to get at the definition of a gene, right? So they're showing you that this tiny little section here, they're going to call this section of the DNA a gene. And so when we start looking at what a gene actually is later, if you use your images, it's going to help you to understand what they're talking about. The next characteristic of life is that all living things grow and develop. Every living thing, no matter how complex they are as adults, they all start as one cell. If you're an animal, that cell is called a zygote, and it's formed when a sperm fertilizes an egg. As these cells divide from 1 to 2, and 2 to 4, and 4 to 8, and over the course of 9 months to form a whole brand new baby, you develop in complexity and size, and your body becomes able to do different things than it could do when you were just 2 cells big, for example. Another characteristic of living things is that they are able to respond to their environment. So stimuli can lead to different responses. For example, probably you've been cold at some point and noticed that you get goosebumps, and if you're cold enough, you might even shiver. If you go from a light room to a dark room, your pupils will dilate, or vice versa if you go from a dark room to a light room. And that allows more or less light into your eye so you can see. Probably you've seen a dog pant, or maybe you've noticed even plants tend to grow in the direction of a light source. So it doesn't matter if you're a plant or animal or even a bacteria, we all have the ability to respond to our environment. Living things also reproduce. They make copies of themselves. They create the next generation. Now, most plants and animals engage in sexual reproduction, where there's a mom and a dad, and those two parents provide the sperm and the egg, or half of the genetic material, to form a new zygote. And of course, then that zygote will grow and develop. If you're a bacteria or a fungi or a protist, you usually reproduce through asexual reproduction, where a single parent produces offspring that are exact copies of themselves. When you only have one parent contributing DNA, you're not going to have any genetic diversity. That's one of the advantages of sexual reproduction, is that with two parents, you increase your genetic diversity, and therefore it helps the population survive. Another characteristic of living things is they all have to obtain and use material and energy from their environment. If you're an animal, you take in energy in the form of the food that you eat, and you breathe oxygen. And through a process called cellular respiration, we can digest those sugars and use the oxygen to create a molecule called ATP. It's short for adenosine triphosphate. ATP is actually the most important source of energy for all living things on the planet. And we have an entire unit devoted to talking about ATP. If you're a plant, you'll take in carbon dioxide and sunlight and water and use that to make sugar in the process of photosynthesis. Again, we have an entire chapter devoted to photosynthesis, so we'll talk more about that later in the year. Metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that occur in a particular living organism, or even just a cell, that happen to keep us alive. Usually, when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about chemical reactions that involve energy transformation. For example, digesting sugars or making ATP. The next characteristic of living things is that, taken as a group, they evolve. So we already said that organisms have the ability to respond to stimuli in their environment, but as a population, we actually can change over time to become better adapted to our environment. And that's because if you have not great adaptations, you're less likely to survive, and if you don't survive, you're obviously not reproducing, and if you don't reproduce, then your genes, and so your traits, don't get passed on to the next generation. So evolutionary change actually links all forms of life to a common origin about 3.5 billion years ago, and we can find evidence of this shared history in all living things, including the fossil record, homologous and analogous structures, the structure of DNA and protein. there's a lot of evidence that supports that we have changed over time from what our ancestors used to be. Living things also maintain homeostasis. This means we can maintain our stable internal conditions that we need to survive. For example, we have the ability to maintain a temperature around 98.6 degrees if you're a human, and obviously we need that to live. We know that if our temperature goes too high, that can be dangerous to our health, right? When we get a fever. And so often if your fever goes too high, you go to a doctor, they might give you an aspirin. If it gets really high, they might even throw you in a cold water bath to try and bring your body temperature down. Other things that we have to regulate include things like our blood sugar, our blood pressure, our heart rate, and many more things as well. Biologists also study life at different levels. So, for example, the smallest level we're concerned with is the chemical level. These are going to be the atoms that make up most living things. That includes carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Those atoms combine to form molecules of life, molecules like DNA, which belongs in a category called nucleic acid. There are 4 categories total that we're going to look at: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids, and they all work together to build living cells. So the cell level is our next level. There are many different kinds of cells, and we'll look at them when we get into the unit on cells. Cells, if you're multicellular, don't live alone. They work together as groups. Groups of cells that perform a common function are called tissues, and those tissues can band together to form organs. And organs don't work in isolation either. They're parts of systems. So, for example, your digestive system is more than just your stomach. It's your mouth, your tongue, your esophagus, your stomach, your intestines, your pancreas. All of these things have to work together in order for you to extract the nutrients from the food. And you don't have just one organ system, you have many. So there's a digestive system, a nervous system, a respiratory system, a cardiovascular system, and a whole bunch more. And all of them work to keep you, the individual organism, alive. And we don't live in isolation. We are parts of groups called populations. So a population is all of the same type of organism or members of the same species that live in a particular place at the same time and can interbreed. And populations don't live in isolation either, right? We interact with many different other kinds of species, and that makes up our community. So if you look out your window, you'll see maybe a maple tree, different kinds of grasses, birds, animals. They're all parts of our community. Our community is part of our ecosystem. This is all of the living and non-living things that we interact with. So here in Hobart, our ecosystem might include Deep River County Park, right? There's Deep River, there's Lake George, there are all of the animals around here and plants that we interact with, and all of that together make up the biosphere. The biosphere is the portion of Earth that supports life. It goes from the bottom of the ocean way up into the atmosphere. So all of these levels are what we study as biologists. And we'll be looking at all of them throughout the year in this class as well. All right. Organisms are classified into different groups. So you might remember this from elementary school: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. A species is one particular type of thing, and members of a species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So we are part of a genus and species called Homo sapiens, and if you have a dog at home, they would be genus Canis, species Familiaris. There's about 2 million different living species that have been identified, and that's really important. It's part of the biodiversity in the biosphere. So again, the biosphere is the portion of Earth that supports life and includes all of the living things and all of the places or ecosystems in which they're found. Every part of the biosphere is connected with every other part of the biosphere, and it includes many different environments. You might remember from elementary school or middle school that ecosystems are grouped into different kinds of biomes. For example, there's a tropical rainforest ecosystem, grasslands, desert, temperate forest, taiga, tundra, mountains, polar ice, and then there are also aquatic ecosystems, freshwater, saltwater, and things like that. So each ecosystem is not totally independent of its surrounding ecosystems. They interact. So for example, when polar ice caps melt, even though those polar ice caps might be way up north or down south, that cold water entering the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean is going to move, and it's going to affect other ecosystems in the world. Biodiversity is another vocab word that refers to the variety of living things in a particular area. So not how many living things in a particular area, but how many different living things are in a particular area. And biodiversity generally increases from the poles towards the equator. This means that nearer the equator, there are more different kinds of living things than there are, say, in the North Pole or the South Pole. Thanks for watching. For more resources, including printable notes, worksheets, and links to online practice, visit my website at www.sevengablescience.com and like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Seven Gable Science, to keep learning.